Welcome to week 11. We are in the final stages of the semester. We've made it through midterms. We're back into the roll of things. Last week, we talked about prisons and the makeup of the population of prison. Today, we're going to talk about parole, reintegration, and reentry into society because we do not intend to keep people incarcerated for the rest of their lives unless, of course, the crime that they have committed is so heinous. We have no other choice but to keep them in prison for the rest of their life, the remaining days alive. Um, but today we're going to talk about parole. Let me share my screen, and we are going to share the content screen. Okay, and week 11. If we scroll down here just a little bit more, the PowerPoint, these are my notes right here. The notes for you to look at. This is the PowerPoint that we're about to go over. The parole discussion. The parole discussion this week is already up and running. There's nobody but posted to it yet. Access to each of the current assess uh, the each of the current issues in parole and reentry for their ability to reduce mass incarceration. And this is something that we came up with and what we saw, and we discussed it last week um, with incarceration rates and the kinds of people that are in prison and why they're in prison and how they ended up in prison. It was a really fun discussion. I'm going to get into grading all of that this afternoon. I got to change a tire in my truck first, but I'm going to get into grading that. I had a lot of fun talking about Robert Merton and strain theory and Burgess and concentric circles theory or concentric zones theory. And, a lot of you guys brought up race and racism and prejudice and all of these reasons for the disproportionate representation of ethnic and racial minorities in prison. And, you know, I think the answer is a little bit more important or a little bit more nuanced than just the color of your skin. Now, the prison I am at, I have 1,150 inmates in the prison. Of that 1,150 inmates, 100 of them are black or African American. The remainder are Hispanic and white. Um, so, what we see in the world of statistics, I don't think always measures up to telling you the whole truth. There's a book that there is a book available that we can look at, and this book is called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. I can make a statistic tell you anything I want it to say. Okay. Um, I wrote a paper, one of my first quantitative research projects that I published was called Racism Does Not Equal Disproportionality. And what I evaluated was, or disproportionality does not equate to racism. What I reported on and what my research was on was the law enforcement use of fatal force. The law enforcement across this country, on average, year to year, uh, kill offenders 1,100 times each and every year. That's a horrible number, but we're also losing between 60 and 100 officers killed in the line of duty every year. And this creates the statistics. 33% of the people killed by police are African Americans. Okay, when they only represent 14% of the general population. So we have to sit there and we have to look and we have to go, why is this so disproportionately high? Well, it's because police kill African Americans more often than they kill anybody else. Well, statistically, sure. If 33% of the people killed by police are African American, that means 67% of the people killed by police are not. Meaning, statistically, there is a great, humongous difference between the number of whites and Hispanics that are being killed by law enforcement and the number of uh, African Americans that are being killed by law enforcement or being treated or being oppressed. Okay, a lot of it had to do with the threat, the category of threat. Of the 33% of the African Americans that were killed by police in 2019, we found that 97% of them were armed with a firearm or other dangerous, deadly weapon and a threat to law enforcement. So, if you're going to be a threat to law enforcement, you're going to find yourself um, getting shot. And I had an encounter with the police a few months ago, and you know, my nephew over here fell in love with some girl on the internet, and he went and she ran away from home, and he went and got her and brought her out here. They got married and all of that fun stuff. And then her mother shows up at my gate, and I don't let her in on the property. So she calls the police, and the police show up, and I'm armed, and I have a gun, and I unconceal the gun, and I tell the police officers I'm wearing and I'm carrying a firearm. And he goes, "Yep, so am I. All's good. You leave your gun alone, I'll leave my gun alone." Is that because I'm white? I don't know. Uh, I left my gun alone. I didn't even lean on my gun, and I have a habit of leaning on the handle of my firearm. I have the same habit of leaning on my COP, my gas at work. I have a habit of leaning on it and putting my hand on it. Um, I didn't get shot. Police officer didn't get shot. Police officer never feared for his life, uh, and things were perfect. Okay. So, you know, what I tell them, well, I had this talk with my sons and my daughters uh, to make sure that at no point do they position themselves in a place to where they make the officer nervous. Because if the officer gets nervous, then he gets afraid. And once he gets afraid, he's going to resort to force. But what we were seeing last week is that um, we had a lot of people that was blaming race and racism and prejudice and bias based on skin color on why people were finding themselves in prison. Where, in fact, Robert Merton's strain theory suggests that disproportionate opportunity is the reason why we find the poor in prison. And this poor doesn't matter the color of your skin, it doesn't matter at all. Robert Merton's theory suggests that when people cannot provide for themselves and they cannot provide for their families, they're going to turn to criminality. Okay? And we're going to see this. I think we're going to see an increase in crime starting uh, next week, really, because the government is shut down. SNAP payments, food stamp payments, welfare payments are all supposed to make it to the poor on the first this week. I think it's what, Friday or Saturday. I think it's Friday is the first, and everybody should be paid, and they're not going to get paid. The military is not going to get paid. SNAP benefits are not going to get paid. Food stamps are not going to get paid. And all of these items, all of these people who find themselves without the funds to feed their family are going to turn to charity, or they're going to turn to crime. And as this government shutdown continues, we're going to see more and more people turning to crime because they're not getting the needs. Robert Merton says that the strain on your world causes you to commit crime. Okay. So this week's discussion is to assess the issues within parole and reentry, and for their ability to reduce mass incarceration. And that's what discuss this week is about. And that's what we're going to discuss. And we're about to go over that. We're about to go over that lecture here in that PowerPoint, starting right now. So let me change. I'm going to stop sharing this, and then I'm going to come in and I'm going to share my content, my screen, so that we can work on the lecture. So here we go. Stop sharing my PowerPoint, and we're going to turn the PowerPoint into full screen, and there we go. Let me take this and move it up here in the corner. Okay, so we're going to be discussing early release and reentry. It is chapter 8 of your textbook. The learning objectives are for you to present a brief history of the people development and the parole of people development in the United States, explain what types of people are on parole, discuss the reentry issues, persons who face the issues people face while on parole, and that's what our discussion forum is going to be about this week. I'm going to explain what a parole releasing authority is and what happens at a parole hearing. I'm going to summarize current issues in parole. So let's get started, jumping right in. Parole is a discretionary release of an individual from confinement in order to serve the remainder of her sentence in the community. Okay? So there's discretionary release, and these are early releases based on the paroling authority's assessment of eligibility. Okay? So, I wish I could show you my screens. Every person has a short date, they call it a short way in the prison. And this is the day that they expect. Now that's their 60% mark. That is the minimum amount of time that you are required to serve in prison. And then after that, you can seek or you can find and be eligible for parole. Mandatory release is the early release after a specific time period specified by law and in the courtroom decision. So I'm sentencing you to 20 years in prison. You'll be paroled after 10, and then you'll be under mandatory supervision for the last 10 years of your sentence. So the parole concept has its roots in the 18th century in English penal practice that's started in Australia. The first legislating authority for authorizing parole in the United States was enacted in the state of Massachusetts in 1837. And what parole did was turned you into an indentured servant. Okay? The Wickersham Commission reported that parole was logical because it was an inexpensive way to supervise individuals. The report stated that a person who is conditionally released from prison into the community earns money, unlike a person who's in prison who does not earn anything. I know the federal government, if you're an orderly and you work for the federal government, you get paid a wage. The state of Texas, these guys who work, my clerk, the SSIs who clean the building that I work in, clean my office, empty the trash, sweep and mop the floors and buff the floors. They don't get paid in Texas. They don't get paid a wage. They get paid time, which means I was looking at a guy's record the other day, and he was sentenced to 7 years flat. He served 3 years. He's got 2 years of working. He's got 8 months waiting to come to prison, and he's got a year and a half work time, which put him at over 7 years. He should be free. He's not, and I know why, and I'll tell you why here in a second. But he should be free. He should be out in the streets because he served his time. Okay, he should be on parole until his flat time of 7 years is complete. But he should be eligible for parole. But because he is has an aggravated sentence, he has to serve a minimum of 60% of his time. So if he's got 7 years, he's got to serve at least 3.5, almost 8 years before he's eligible for parole. And once that's done, once he's got 4 years in, um, he'll be eligible for parole and he'll be able to go home. Okay, so the American Probation and Parole Association, which I used to be a member of, the mission statement of parole is to prepare, select, and assist offenders who are, after a reasonable period of incarceration, could benefit from an early release, while at the same time ensuring an appropriate level of public protection through conditions of parole and provisions of supervision services. This is accomplished by assisting the parole authority in their decision making and enforcement of parole conditions. Okay, so one of the things that the Texas inmates have is called ITP. It's the Individual Treatment Program. And the Individual Treatment Program consists of Wyndham School District classes like a GED. They've got a class called Changes. They have an anger management program. They've got a parenting class. And they've got a lot of different programs. And they have college. And I already said GEDs, but they've got college opportunities. They've got a lot of classes and a lot of things that the school district does because it is believed that the school and education, a proper education, increased education, will prevent individuals from resorting to criminality. Because if you have an education, you're going to make more money. And we find that the vast majority of inmates do not have a high school education or even a high school equivalency. So before you can leave the Texas prison system, you have to, at a minimum, have a GED. Okay. Are there some in the prison that have high school educations and bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees and PhDs? Yes, there are. But statistically, and we're going back to statistics, we've got lies, damn lies, and statistics. Statistically, the people who find themselves in prison do not have high school education or equivalency. So we want to make sure that they get a high school education. Okay. On the other side of this information on this ITP is their faith-based programming. And the faith-based programming is something that we can, as a faith-based facilitator. There's a faith-based dorm. There is Thinking for a Change. There's Voyagers. There's Overcomers. There's AA. There's church. There's all kinds of different programs. Winning and Working at Home. Malachi Dads, which is a faith-based parenting program. All of these programs are available to the inmates, and when they complete them, it's put on their ITP. And this ITP goes to the parole board and the paroling authority. And based upon the completion rates, based upon how the inmate has behaved and how the inmate accomplishes the programs that are made available to him, will help make the decision on whether or not this particular offender gets placed on parole. We provide pre-release and post-release services are done by parole. There is a institutional parole officer who works inside the prison and helps prepare for reentry. We also have a reentry person who helps make sure that these people have got good addresses, they've got their driver's license, they've got a social security card, they've got all if their driver's license hasn't expired. Most of the guys that I deal with, their driver's license expired decades ago. But they make sure that they have ID They make sure a state issued ID that's not their inmate ID. They make sure that they have a social security card. They get them hooked up with Project Rio. They get things set up, help them find a job when they leave. They help them find a halfway house. Reentry will help you find a halfway house so that you can be released and you can go, when you can get out of prison. They work cooperatively with all sectors of the criminal justice system to ensure the development and attainment of mutual objectives. Volunteer services at the prison system calls the victims of this offender and tells them, hey, so and so's getting out. The victims of crime also have a voice on whether or not an offender is released. Okay, reentry has occurred since the Walnut Street Jail opened in 1773. Reentry has been an ongoing struggle for the prison system. The scale of offender reentry is larger today than it's ever been before because we're sending more people home. More people are being released from prison today than at any time in the history of the world. Okay, so reentry and parole face enormous challenges in managing the reentry of persons that are leaving prison, especially when parole are so low paid. You're required to have a college degree to work in parole, but parole is, I was looking at parole officers, and a level one parole officer barely makes $40,000 a year in the state of Texas. That's not enough to live and pay off your student loans. It's just not. Um, so we do face some people with college educations are going to go find a job doing something else somewhere else. I barely make 50 something. I'm in the mid 50s with the state of Texas. And I could make so much more money doing something else. But I have a calling to do what I do. I enjoy what I do. And then I'm an adjunct. Hopefully, I'll continue to adjunct for the University of Arkansas Fort Smith. If not, I will find other schools to adjunct on. I have a PhD in corrections. Well, might as well say is in corrections. My PhD is in human services, specializing in inmate treatment and rehabilitation. I'm doing what I am trained to do, and hopefully I'm teaching other people to do the same thing. So the collateral consequences are legal and regulatory restrictions that limit or prohibit people convicted of crimes from accessing housing, public benefits, employment, businesses, and we call it checking the box. Okay, so because you have to check the box, you don't get to do all of the things that people that don't have to check the box can do. And that has to do with living in certain houses and certain apartment complexes. If apartment complexes is too close to a school, ever, if there's too many kids in this apartment complex, it could keep you from renting if you're a sex offender. Okay. Nobody, it's hard to find employers who are willing to hire felons. Okay? But there are education programs. And if you can get an education, and I know people who leave prison and they go to Texas State Technical College, Technical Institute, or they go to university, or they go do something. And then the box doesn't mean as much because you've went on and you have shown your dedication to become a productive member of society. And the box, because you've got a college degree or you've got a training, you've got a certificate, you're certified and qualified to do a job, they're more likely to hire you. You can't own or possess firearms while you're on paper. You can't vote while you're on paper. You can't hold public office in many states. You cannot serve as a jury. Okay? If you are on a substance abuse case, you cannot get Pell Grants or financial student aid in any way. You have to pay for it out of your pocket. Okay. So being on parole and coming out of prison, there's a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. So one of the issues, and this is one of the issues, so the federal reentry legislation has been put in place. The federal government's involvement in reentry programs occurs through grant funding, through state and local tribal jurisdictions, nonprofit organizations, and the reentry programs developed by the United States Probation and Pretrial Services for persons under supervised release. Okay, so if you hire an inmate, if you hire a former inmate, you can get tax breaks. You know, it's just like the state of Texas hires me. I am a veteran of the United States. So the federal government provides money to the state of Texas to help pay my salary. Okay. Well, a lot of states do the same thing, and it's funded by the federal government. If a company hires a felon, a convicted felon who has been incarcerated, they can file this paperwork because of this legislation and receive financial incentives or rewards for hiring freshly released inmates from the prison system. The First Step Act is a bipartisan criminal justice reform law. It was signed into law in 2018 by President Trump on reforming sentencing laws to improve the conditions of confinement in federal prisons and to help with release. The fair chance licensing across the country, states are also taking steps to advance this fair chance licensing policies. These are laws and regulations that aim to reduce the barriers for employment for individuals with criminal records by removing questions about criminal history from occupational licensing applications, or delaying such inquiries until after the hiring process. Fair chance licensing policies generally fall into one of two categories: banning the box, which I've already mentioned, and individualized assessments, where, so banning the box means that you don't have to check the box that you're a convicted felon. And the other initiative is that we look at convicted felons on a case-by-case basis and looking at an individualized assessment. What has this person done since they've been convicted? Okay. There's a scripture that a proverb that I'm going to put up on the wall. It doesn't matter why you got here. It matters what you do now. Okay. So there's these fair chance licensing programs are intended to help address employment issues and make sure and help people get jobs on an individual basis, and judge a person for their actions since they made this worst decision in their life that ended them up in a prison. Okay, granting parole, or the paroling release authority, is a person or a correctional agency with the authority to grant parole, to revoke parole, and to discharge somebody from parole. In the state of Texas, it is called the Texas Pardons and Paroles. Okay. It is a formal proceeding where the parole board reviews the case of an incarcerated individual to determine whether or not they're eligible for early release to be placed on parole. A lot of the guys in my prison, they're all excited about parole, and then they get a set off. They get a set off for 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years. And what this board does is they review what the inmate has done while they're in prison. They talk to the victims. The inmate himself can be present via Zoom. There's an institutional representative who represents the state, and the hearing parole board members, and a lot of guys hire lawyers to go to the hearing themselves to represent them in the hearing to see if they can be granted for parole. And so conditions of parole is reporting. If you're released from parole, you have 24 hours to report to your parole officer. You have to maintain employment or go to school, or you need to be in a treatment program. If the treatment program doesn't allow you to work or go to school, you have to be regularly in that treatment program. You have to have regular meetings with your parole officer. And typically and normally this is once a month. You have to obey the laws of the state, the city, the municipality, the county. You have to follow the orders of all criminal justice professionals and the courts. You have to obtain a travel permit before traveling. Now, there's a guy in my unit. He's a dedicated Muslim. He came to prison back in the 80s. Before he became a Muslim, he was just another atheist, agnostic criminal. He got busted for armed robbery, attempted murder, and some other things. And he was sentenced to 80 years in prison. So in 2002, he gets parole. Okay, after serving 20 years in prison, he gets parole and he goes home. And for 20 years, he was until 2020 or 2019. It was 2019. He was a model citizen. He was doing everything he was supposed to do. He was on parole. He was going to church. He had a job. He was paying his bills. He was taking care of his family. And in 2019, he decides he's going to Egypt. So he asked permission to go to Egypt. The state of Texas said no. He went anyway. He is now back in prison, serving a minimum of 20 years before he is eligible to see parole again. So that'll be 60 years that he has served. He's got an ancient number. There's been, 200,000 people sent to prison since he got out of prison. But now he's back in prison because he traveled without permission. No firearms, no weapons while you're on paper. Actual federal law says that a convicted felon cannot possess or own firearms. So you can never get a firearm again. No drugs, no substance abuse. Every time you have contact with the police, even if they're stopped and they're doing community-oriented policing and they said, "Hi, how you doing?" You need to report that to your parole officer. You do not work as an informant. You do not work for the police on parole. That is a violation of parole. Okay. If the police are threatening to charge you with something, you do not become an informant so that the police do not follow through. If parole finds out about it, they're going to send you back to prison. You cannot leave the area. Okay. You also got to follow all the orders of your parole and any special conditions. If you're a sex offender, you have to register with the county sheriff. You have to provide pictures and fingerprints, DNA samples. Okay. Discretionary parole is the most common type of parole that occurs across the country, and it can be denied and it can be revoked at any time because of a violation of parole. A violation of parole is called a blue warrant. The blue warrant is issued. It's signed by the judge. Police go get you. You go back to prison. Proponents of discretionary parole are people such as the Probation and Parole Association, and they argue that parole boards serve a salutary function by requiring persons incarcerated to focus on their efforts on successful reentry from prison. And if you're not going to chase or pursue successful reentry, they'll just send you back to prison. Mandatory parole is granted automatically to persons who have served a certain portion of their sentence, usually a predetermined percentage of the sentence. The Truth in Sentencing Act that Clinton signed into law back in the 90s, 1990s, was a minimum of 60%. I think Texas is trying to reduce that 60% to 50% to help stem overcrowding and mass incarceration. Under the system of mandatory parole, there is no parole board. There is no time off for good behavior. You serve day for day. Individuals serve 2/3 of their sentence in prison and the remaining 1/3 on supervised release. But it's 60%, 66% according to this slide. But the law states 60%. Non-revocable parole is a type of unsupervised parole that, unlike regular parole, cannot be revoked for technical violations. Persons are returned to prison only if they are arrested on new charges and new offenses, and they're convicted and sentenced to another term of incarceration. Only persons convicted of nonviolent, non-sexual, low-level crimes who have been assessed and determined not to be a serious risk to the public are eligible for an NRP. Some of the characteristics of people on parole: 87% are with the state, 73% are male, 33% are white, 28% are African American, the Hispanics make up 13%, and it goes on. 24% of the people on parole is their race and ethnicity is unknown. Um, Status of supervision, 64% is active. And then you've got 22% that's unknown. You've got 6% that have absconded. Type of entry onto parole, mandatory. Mostly it's discretionary. Some of it's mandatory. And I don't know what the other could be. So voting rights, parolee voting rights. Arguments for felon disenfranchisement. Um, disenfranchisement. Um, Inmates should be denied voting rights as a matter of principle. They have taken the rights away from their victims, and why should they have the rights to vote? States have the right to deny felons the right to vote as an added punishment. It sends a message about respect for law. And felons cannot be trusted to make politically informed decisions. And it denies the arguments against disenfranchisement is that it denies individuals the ability to participate in the democratic process. It's unfair to minorities. It's not an effective form of punishment. It's inconsistent with reentry, and it's counterproductive to reducing recidivism. Okay, so, but the biggest argument is if you didn't care about the rights of others, so that you justified going and committing a crime against those people, you should not be given the right to vote. Once you're off paper and you are no longer under correctional supervision, you regain the right to vote. Reentry court involves programs that employ the authority of the court and involves a team approach. You know, that's normally the judge, a probation and parole officer, the prosecutor, your public defender, and community service providers such as substance abuse counselors, sex abuse counselors. The team marshals the resources that are necessary to provide the support and to help, even education, to help the individual remain in the community and not violate so that they end up back in prison. Okay, reintegration involving victims. Victims can assist parole boards by providing parole members with relevant information, offering their experience and expertise by encouraging offender accountability. Okay, rights given to the victims by most states is to be notified about parole proceedings, to be heard on matters about parole, to be present at parole proceedings, and to receive restitution as a condition of parole. But what victims do not have the right to is contacting their offender. Okay, and you know, I got a phone call a couple months ago from a victim, and he called me up and said, "So and such inmate is in your prison on the charge of murder. He murdered my son, and he's in prison, and he's coming up for parole. And I want to talk to him. The parole board has asked my recommendation on whether or not parole should be granted. And I want to talk to him before I make this decision." And I said, "No, you can't talk to him." "Yeah, but it's my right to talk to him because I have to know why he killed my son and if he's repentant and remorseful and if he's willing to apologize to me before I authorize or I recommend or I agree with him getting parole." I said, "If you're requiring an apology from the inmate in order for you to grant parole, you're not going to get one. So you might as well not recommend parole and go ahead and leave this inmate in my custody, in my care, for the next 3 to 5 years, whatever his set off is." Okay, so reentry and community policing, the increase in the number of persons being released each year from the state and federal prisons into crime-ridden neighborhoods that lack services and support systems is more than community correction officers can handle. It's more than a parole officer can handle. So we have to deal and we have to rely upon nonprofit organizations. Despite all of the efforts being made at prisoner reform, most persons are still leaving prison unprepared for successful reentry. And I am going to be the keynote speaker at a discussion at a conference for Kairos of Texas. There's Kairos in Arkansas. It's might be something you might want to look into. Get involved with Kairos of Arkansas and help with this prison ministry. There are three branches or three wings of Kairos, and that's Kairos Inside that deal in the prison. There's Kairos Torch that deals with youthful offenders and at-risk offenders, and then there's Kairos Outside that work with women who have been affected by incarceration, whether they were in prison themselves or if they had a family member or loved one in prison. And this Kairos Outside is probably my favorite ministry because it helps prepare the household for the returning of this inmate. Because as I've already stated, most of the inmates, most of our offenders are returned to the communities where they left. Okay, so if they do not have a strong foundation in moral turpitude, whether it's through God or religion or faith or some other authority higher than their own, they're going to end up back in criminality and they're going to end up back in prison because of the fact that that's where they came from and got in trouble. So Kairos Outside helps prepare the household. So those stresses and those triggers that will influence an offender to reoffend or to violate the conditions of their parole can be addressed and have a greater rate of success. Okay, statistics show and statistics say that 84%, 8 in 10 men will return to prison within 10 years after release. So this tells me that parole and reentry have some serious issues and serious problems that they're facing. So the community-focused parole, the mission statement that we need a mission statement that the public understands. It is to increase the visibility of parole work and to build partnerships. Very few people know about parole. When I was a probation officer for the state of Texas, I had a coat on the back. It said probation. And I wore it everywhere I went. I was a representative of the county as a probation officer. But it got more, they would see me going to bars to check for DWIs. I would wander around playgrounds outside of schools looking for sex offenders. We participate in the Halloween Lights Out program. I know now what they're doing for Halloween is sex offenders are having to go up to the parole office or even county jail for the night so that when kids come knocking on their door, they're not tempted to violate or to reoffend. But the process of engaging the community is important, not only for getting jobs, helping us watch the offender. Okay, so that is all we've got today. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and minimize, and there we are. As you've noticed, it is sunny and bright today. I'm glad I'm wearing my hat because it's shading my eyes, although my transitional glasses have already got super dark. Discussions are fun. I've enjoyed the discussions and I've enjoyed what we've discussed today. And I hope to see all of this in the forums and as to look at the issues that address without spending so much time focusing on racism, because I don't think that racism is the whole story. Yes, it's part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole story. And I think that claiming and calling racism is the cheater's way to find and to resolve and to fix the problems that we find in our country. And especially trying to establish and help these offenders re-enter into society and become productive members of the society. So until I see you in the forums, I hope you have a great day.